So I was thinking, looking at the schedule today and hearing some of the talks, that this is sort of like one of those plays that sort of starts at the end of the story and then sort of unwinds to the beginning. So my talk probably would have made much more sense at the start. So we started with Richard talking about, how we can now start measuring things, and we're going to end up with mine, which is just basically going to be this list of questions that we can't answer. So it might have been better to do it the other way. But what I wanted to do is just, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody, but I think hopefully can still serve some use, which is to really give a sense of what kinds of questions policymakers need answered in this area, that we really don't know how to do this yet. And some of these questions are probably at some level unanswerable, but still starting to think toward them, think about how to approach them, I think is still useful as we try to think about STEM measurement issues. So again, these are mostly questions. I take some solace as a story that the physicist I.I. Rabi used to tell, that when he came home from school as a kid in Germany, his mother used to ask, "Did you ask any good questions in school today?" instead of "What did you learn today?" So that'll be sort of the approach that I'm going to take. So I'm going to do these in terms of categories, and that align pretty well with the kinds of categories of talks there were today. So starting with R&D spending to start as a whole. The biggest question one more word of introduction, two things that policymakers have to deal with. One is, and again, these are both obvious but sometimes overlooked. One is choice, right? Policy making is about making choices. So just being able to sort of give an appraisal of how well a system is working or what it's providing doesn't necessarily provide enough information to decide, say, where to put the next marginal dollar, or in the situation we're now, where to take the last marginal dollar, who to take the last marginal dollar away from. And the second is, at some level, despite public cynicism about politics, they actually have to be careful about overpromising, which people lobbying them ought to be careful about, but often are not. So with that in mind, so looking at the kinds of questions that policymakers really have in this area that we can't quite answer yet. So the first one is on the federal R&D budget, and the primary question is, how large should the federal budget be for R&D? We actually, because we have a lot of difficulty connecting R&D to innovation, as Dan was talking about, and innovation to jobs, I'll get back to that, which is also shown on one of Dan's slides, actually what policymakers are generally most worried about. In figuring out when the budget is, in effect, large enough to reach a certain, to accomplish certain goals, we don't have that. And so most of the work we have is really designed to basically say, the larger you can get it, the better, which is of some but minimal use and almost no use when the issue is how far can you contract, or at least have growth at a lower level. Sometimes to make it sound sort of more like an actual metric, what people do here is talk about R&D as a percent of GDP. 3% is the number that's been thrown around for a long time. There's, as far as I've ever heard, absolutely no justification for this number whatsoever. It's based on what some other countries were doing at a point where they seem to be doing well, including Japan, which we don't worry about so much anymore. But there was really there's nothing scientific about that number. And in fact, in looking over some things this morning in preparation, the Science and Technology Indicators report points out that in the 50s, which is sort of the golden age for that, whether we say it consciously or not, for what we often have in mind when we're trying to figure out what we'd really like the economy to look like, the target number was 1% of GDP. So that's the big question that we can't get at. And even looking at the overall spending levels for federal R&D, it's not clear. It aggregates so many different things that it's not clear whether that overall number actually would be, even if you knew more about what the relationships were, if that would be the useful number to look at. But it's an easy number to calculate, even though we calculated after the fact. Nobody's making a federal R&D budget per se. It's an aggregate of individual decisions. We tend to use it as a litmus test, but it's really a litmus test of political desire, political will, political support. It's not a litmus test of what we're actually, or any kind of an indicator of what we're actually getting out of it. And then again, in this time of budget cutting, that would be what would be most useful for policymakers. Within that, I just talked about how aggregated it is. Composition of the federal R&D budget. So depending on what it is you're trying to get out of it, if it's some kind of innovation, what would you actually do with the R&D budget if the goal was explicitly some kind of innovation? This has happened from time to time. It usually results in philosophical debates about the role of the government. It very rarely results in any debates about whether the government is actually good or bad or indifferent at trying to structure the R&D budget in a way that will produce innovation. That obviously relates to this basic and applied, whether those categories still matter and whether they result in outcomes. It also deals with field. So for at least a couple of decades now, one of the issues in the budget has been the quote-unquote balance between the physical sciences and the biological sciences. But balance is really a word picked, I think, consciously or not, to sound benign and clear when it is anything but, right? We don't know what a proper balance would be because that's a proper balance to achieve what? Balance in this case really is like a bunch of young siblings squabbling over how much water to get in their glass, or better, juice, I guess. It doesn't matter whether they're different ages, different sizes, have different health, they all want the same amount of juice in their glass. And that's basically what the debate about balance has meant. If, that's not to say that there aren't real issues about the fact that the disproportionate growth of federal R&D has been on the biomedical side. It's that we don't have a lot of information about how you would decide when that was actually causing a problem. Education, another area that has been discussed today. There's obviously a huge amount we don't know about education and what works, but the one thing with the science and tech education debate tends to be had in isolation from all other debates on education. So if you go to a meeting of sort of any academic field, they will complain about the decline of education, and also there's not enough focus on their field, and this is a problem. My background is actually in history. I can make at least to me, a plausible argument about the way we teach history is really bad, and the fact that, and it's very hard to have a common culture and a functioning society if people don't understand things about the past, and it's hard to have proper critical reasoning skills if people don't know how to ask questions about change over time. You'd hear the same, all things that are equivalent to what you would hear in the debate on science and tech education, but the science and tech education debate happens as if that's all that's going on, not as part of a general debate about schools, not about a general debate about what kind of education we need, and also often as if it's the only field that has thought about critical reasoning skills, which an assumption that probably indicates a lack of critical reasoning. Then obviously workforce, again, the thing that, and not just in the time of recession, the issue that policymakers are most consistently and determinedly worried about is jobs. And we don't have a very good understanding of the relationship of innovation to jobs. Presumably pure Luddism is wrong, but it's not clear that, but if you talk to innovation economists or people involved in innovation, they will not make a claim that innovation naturally leads to additional jobs either. And then the question is, what kind of jobs? So I think one of the, I don't know whether it came up today or not, but I think one of the critical issues the country faces is the growing wealth disparity. Where does innovation fit into that? In what ways can innovation address it? In what ways does innovation exacerbate it? To what extent can you actually have a society that looks like the society we were used to if you have an economy that's built almost entirely on, let's say, high technology and a few high-level service industries? Do we know how to actually get a society that looks like the one that we were used to through most of the 20th century and certainly the post-war period in terms of income differentiation with the kind of economy and innovation we're trying to create? I don't think anyone knows that. I think that question about where the income disparity issues fit in with the kinds of issues we talk about here is one of the things that is the biggest gap in this discussion. I think there's also a concern about overpromising in this area. There's no question that we need scientists and engineers for a healthy economy, that innovation is an important part of an economy, but we sometimes make it sound like if all we did was produce more scientists and engineers, everything else would fall into place. This is kind of a weird inversion of if you build it, they will come. This is sort of like if they come, they'll build it. And we have no idea whether that actually makes sense. And that relates to another one of these big questions that we'll never be able to answer, but is important to keep in mind and that policymakers scratch their heads about a lot, which is how many scientists and engineers does the US need? Again, the answer always, from the scientific community is more is better. More probably would be better, but where are they going to work? Will their existence create jobs for themselves? Why, if we need more all the time, why isn't there a price signal indicating that? And related to that, are the international comparisons done in a way that actually can tell us anything? This obviously, a narrower part of that involve things like H-1B visas, where these people actually are going, how they're being used. The bigger question, so you'll hear companies say at the same time that we say we're producing scientists and engineers, we can't get the ones we want here. I don't know that there's any good information on why actually is that. Where's the mismatch? Is that the companies actually wanting something other than what they're talking about? Is it really a problem in the kinds of training? Is it a geographic issue? This is something one hears all the time, but there doesn't seem to be any real analysis I've seen about why that mismatch between seeming to produce large numbers who should be able to fill into these slots, not having any price signal, and then the companies saying that somehow they can't get who they need. Then there's just one more category I'll deal with now, which is the whole issue of how to structure a technology policy to, even if you decide you know what you need in certain cases, how to structure an R&D and wider technology policy to get there. So this is really a question of, and it relates to something else Dan talked about, having the sole focus be on R&D when you have to look at the entire system. So energy is my pet example of this, and certainly important in policy now. There's a lot of work all the time on what kind of R&D to do for energy. There's the ARPA-E program that grew out of the National Academy report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which has actually ended up being put together in a fairly positive way, ARPA-E that is. But that alone is not going to do anything on these issues without some kind of demand signal. So that doesn't mean, so now there's within that community often this very unproductive debate about, well, do we need more supply, R&D ideas, or do we need a demand signal, when the answer has to be you need both, and the question is how to do them. And Richard was saying that, when I was talking about outside, that he brought up the example of one new product being GE's work on light bulbs. That was a result of federal law saying you needed, that you had to phase out certain kinds of light bulbs. So if it was just about R&D, GE probably would not be putting a lot of money into light bulbs, which is a low margin product. Many other big companies have sold off their light bulb businesses. So where's the relationship there? And then actually looking at specific cases of that, if you put in the demand signal, what did it actually do to R&D? Did it have spillover effects on R&D beyond just trying to deal with a particular light bulb case? What did it do in terms of employment? either on the manufacturing side or the R&D side here. I mean, those are the kinds of cases that we need. So I titled the talk, I think, What Do Policymakers Need to Know, and When Will They Know It? Thinking, I guess, maybe I'd have a brainstorm between when I thought up the title and now about when will they know it. And then this morning I thought, well, actually, that was the whole rest of the day. That's why it's good that the whole thing was reversed. Hopefully, people did give some idea of when, how there can be progress toward this. But I think it is vitally important to, because I think we spend a lot of time, at least in political circles, convincing ourselves we've got all this data showing how good R&D is. And there's not actually a lot of even politically divisive debate on at least the idea that the government has a role in funding basic research, although some of that even now is changing. But for the kinds of questions that in a tough pinch, whether it was the stimulus bill where some of these came up, I don't know if Rush Holt told that story at lunch, where, you know, when he was trying to convince his colleagues we need to put science in the stimulus bill, they said, show me some data about how it'll create jobs, and they had to sort of have one of the miracle things that Dan had on his chalkboard, that plus the way that legislation was put together, and managed to get in there. So we need to keep in mind that some of the kinds of questions, basically all the fundamental questions that you would really ask if you were rigorously putting together policy, all the questions you would be starting from if you were starting from scratch and not just sort of rehearsing the usual debates, we aren't very good at answering those yet. And that's not unique to this field, but I think it's especially bad in this field, partly because the questions are hard, partly because the politics didn't generate the need for it the same way with my other hat on environmental issues. There's plenty of problems, but if you could not come up with at least an argument for what the marginal benefit was of some additional regulation or piece of equipment you were requiring to be used, we'd be in worse shape than we are now, which is hard to believe the way things are in the House right now. But you would not, you wouldn't even be able to get to be the one, the witness getting to be beaten up at the hearing about why your data wasn't believable. So in some ways, the science and tech community has been sort of getting a free pass that other areas of policy have not been able to get. And the question is, someday that may come to an end. When it does, will we have the data to be able to at least do some predictive work that is expected from pretty much every other area of policy, including really tough ones like if you put X number of $100 billion in a stimulus bill, will there be jobs at the end of it? So again, I'd feel better about this talk if this had been the first talk, although I would have had to get here earlier. Hopefully this is still helpful in helping people sort through the current state of affairs and what work still needs to be done. So thank you.